I'm Todd for G66. Welcome to another Tuesday tone tip. On today's video, we're going to take a look at a few things you can do with the multi-band compressor on the AXFX3, FM9 and FM3. I've got my old Strat plugged into my AXFX3, Band Commander amp model at stock settings, my free LT-TV Mix 7 impulse response, and a little bit of the great London Plate reverb. Let's just hear the clean tone to get started. All right, pretty basic clean tone right there. Let's get started by adding a multi-band compressor before the amp block. And I think this is a pretty cool way to use this block. It requires almost no work. You just bring it up at stock settings, you go to the advanced tab, you turn auto attack and release on, and you get a pretty great sounding compressor out of this. Let's just have a listen to it bypassed and then engaged. Now, as you can see on the metering in AXEdit, what a multi-band compressor is doing in this case is splitting our signal into multiple bands, in this case, 3 bands, and then applying compression to each of them independently. So this can be quite a cool way to craft your guitar tone. And just at those stock settings, this to me is a really great kind of compressor to give you more of what you like about your guitar sound. You know, it's not adding a massive boost, it's not massively squishing anything. It just makes everything sound a little bit better, in my opinion. So you can take this a little bit further and you can kind of play around with the levels on each of these bands. So we're not really talking about the specific compression characteristics just yet, but what you can do is you can use this as a little bit of a tone shaping tool. Basically a multi-band compressor I also think of like an EQ. We've got 3 bands in there, and we've got the additional element of being able to add dynamics processing to each band. So it's kind of like a dynamic EQ in that regard. So what you could do here would be to say, hey, you know what? I want my low end and my high end to remain relatively intact. And I just want to crank up the mid-range on this. So I can get a nice kind of mid-range boost on here. So what I would do there is pull up the threshold on the low and the high bands right here. And then let's increase the crossover for the high bands. So I'm gonna bring this up to about 1500 Hertz. Essentially what I'm doing now, you don't have to be too precise, is that between 120 and 1500-ish Hertz, I'm adding compression, but then I wanna bring that level up. So let's hear it without the level boost. I'll start bypassed. Pretty cool. It's got this really nice mid-boost quality that you would get out of an EQ, but of course it is dynamic. Now, to my ears, there's a little bit too much low end being added in there. So I'm going to bring this crossover up to about 400 or 500 Hertz. Let's have a listen to it now. Now what's fun with this is to play around with the threshold ratio and the level control in there. So I could compress the mid-range a little bit more. Let's take the ratio up to 4. I could lower the threshold so that that compression is going to start sooner. I can really crank the level up over here. Let's have a listen to it now. Just got a really unique feel about it that you don't get out of a standard compressor. Furthermore, we can use the level control on the high and the low band because basically they're not doing anything in terms of dynamics processing at the moment. So I could carve out some low end from my tone. So everything below, say like 400-ish Hertz, I'm actually gonna decrease a little bit and I can bring up even more high end in here. So I'm using this kind of like a bright control in front of my amp, and I get this. Now, I'm probably pulling out a little bit too much low end for my taste. I might set this a little bit more conservatively, and we get this. Really, really cool property there where, again, I'm using it like a dynamic EQ. I'm pulling up some mid-range, but if I play really dynamically now, we get this. So in that case, the harder I play, essentially the more it's going to get compressed, and the softer I play, the less it's going to be compressed but still boosted. So it's kind of acting like an expander in that case, which I really, really like. So that's just one way to do that with a kind of clean sound. Well, really we explored a couple of different ways there, using it like a compressor, using it as like a mid-boosted compressor, using it like a clarity control here. And I find this clarity control style thing where you actually don't boost the mids so much and you don't go too crazy with the compression, but you just pull out a little bit of low end and even boost a little bit of high end. We could even compress the high end in here. You can see there's a lot of ideas to be had here. Works really well with crunchy sound. So let's swap over to the AC20 12AX7 treble. We go to the bridge pickup now, we get this. Such a great sounding amp model. Let's kick this in with those settings that I've just been talking about. Now notice on the bridge pickup that this is just that little bit too bright to my ears anyway. So what we can do is let's turn this crossover here up maybe to about 2.5K. I'll bring the threshold down and let's just add some gentle compression to the high end as well, so that when I play softly, I can get my lovely sparkly clean sound. But when I dig in, it's going to take out some of that harsh attack. Now, of course, you wouldn't really get away with that with a regular compressor on there, but just being able to tame that high end, so effective. This is a really cool way to use a multiband compressor for your lower gain sounds in the Fractal products. My absolute favorite application of this multiband compressor / dynamic EQ is definitely on high gain tones. So I'm going to swap over to another guitar. I'll bring up my favorite high gain amp, the USA Lead mid gain, and I'll show you a little multi-band trick that we can use after the amp and cab. So this is my PRS SC245. Let's hear where I've got the USA Lead mid gain set at the moment. Nice and chunky. Now, have a listen to this. I'm going to play the low C chord. I'm in drop C at the moment, so I'm just going to play a big C5. I'll strum it really, really open, and then I'll apply some heavy palm muting, and pay attention to what happens with the low end. The palm mutes kind of build up in this way that can clash with other instruments that live in that low register. So the reason I would want to use a multi-band compressor here and not an EQ to clean up the low end here is that I like the way that sounds when I'm playing strumming wide open, and I just only want to remove the low end when I'm doing those palm mutes. So the trick, and this is a trick that nearly everybody uses nowadays on kind of modern metal guitar productions. Most people credit it to Andy Sneap. But what you do basically, we'll set the threshold at 0 on the low band and the high band, and we're going to kind of zero in between 90 and 350 hertz. There's going to be centered around that 200 hertz frequency range when you do chugs in a drop tuning on your guitar. And basically an attack of around 12.5 milliseconds, a release of about 25 milliseconds, and just play around with the threshold and the ratio so that when you strum wide open, the compressor doesn't kick in, but when you do palm mutes, it's going to pull out stuff between this 90 to 350 hertz zone. So a classic dynamic EQ. You could hear when I was strumming wide open and I turned the multiband comp on and off, the tone didn't change. But when I was palm muting, it sucked out some of that annoying buildup in there. And when you're playing guitar on your own, you are probably going to miss that extra low end in there. But believe me, when you're playing with a bass guitar and drums in a dense mix, that really, really goes a long way to tightening up your tone. Furthermore, we could combine it with another multiband compressor trick before the amp block. And what we're doing here is we are setting the threshold to 0 on the mid and the high band. So we're only going to compress the extreme lows on here. And there's another kind of dynamic trick, but a very popular trick with heavy tones is to high pass filter your guitar sound before the amp. So what we're creating now is basically like a dynamic kind of filter control before the amp. So I've set the crossover 315 hertz, so around 300, 400 hertz on there. You can see the threshold and ratio, like I said, on these two bands is at, well, basically a point where it's not going to do anything. Ratios at 1, thresholds at 0. I'm going to set the respective levels on all three bands at 0. And then basically we're going to do the same thing. I'm just going to bring the threshold down until I can start to see those palm mutes get sucked down by this low band here. So we'll start with the threshold high and we will just pull it down. Now, of course, we can take this even further and we can use this as like a dynamic boost. I've set this crossover quite high, but let's set it maybe to around the 2K mark so that I can really boost the mids here. I'm going to turn the level up to about 9 dB. And now I have this dynamic low cut thing and a mid boost in front of the amp. And of course, I've got my other like chug controller multiband compressor after the amp and the cab there. So there's a bunch of ideas to use the multiband compressor on electric guitar. All of these tricks would work amazingly well on bass guitar as well if you're using your fractal for bass. So there's a couple of my favorite multiband compressor tips and tricks. Of course, if you've got a specific use case for the multiband compressor, please let me and everybody else know in the comments section below. I would love to be able to pick up some tips and tricks. And maybe at some point in the future for a Tuesday Tone Tip, I will compile everybody's user tips and tricks. That might be a really fun one. If you'd like to see and hear that video, let me know in the comments. And I said it before, but I'll say it again. If there's any requests for specific content you would like to see, let me know in the comments section below. Hope you all have a fantastic week, and I'll see you next Tuesday for another Tuesday Tone Tip. Cheers.